You really thought you were entitled to that? The words dripped with disdain, laced with a victorious, almost giddy, cruelty that scraped at the inside of my skull. It wasn't a question seeking an answer, it was a pronouncement, a final, devastating judgment delivered with the casual grace of someone flicking a piece of lint from their expensive sleeve. I could feel the air in the room thicken, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy, suffocating. My gaze, fixed on the worn oak of the conference table, felt like a physical weight. My own hands, resting loosely in my lap, were trembling, a betrayal of the carefully constructed calm I was desperately trying to project. The polished surface reflected distorted images, the smug tilt of his head, the arrogant glint in his eyes, and the desperate, silent plea in my own, reflected back like a ghost. My life, for the past 7 years, had been a meticulously crafted performance of normalcy. A facade built over a foundation of quiet resentment and forced smiles. It was the life I'd accepted when I married him, the life I'd sworn to uphold, even as the cracks began to show almost immediately. He was a man who collected accomplishments like trophies, each one polished to a blinding sheen, and expected everyone around him to admire their gleam. My accomplishments, my contributions, were always secondary, footnotes to his grand narrative. The small business I'd painstakingly built from the ground up, the one that had become the bedrock of our shared financial security, was always our success, but it was vision, drive, that had apparently made it possible. My role was to be the supportive wife, the quiet partner, the one who managed the details he deemed beneath him. And I had played that part meticulously. There was the time, early on, when I'd landed a client that was a complete game changer for the business. It had taken months of persistent outreach, late nights, and strategic maneuvering. When the contract was finally signed, I'd been elated, ready to celebrate our collective win. He'd barely glanced at the paperwork, his attention already fixed on a golf magazine on the coffee table. "That's great, honey," he'd said, his voice distant. "Did you remember to pick up dry cleaning on your way home?" The slight, the dismissal of something I'd poured my heart into, stung more than any outright insult. It was the constant undermining, the subtle erosion of my worth, that chipped away at me, day by day. Then there was the incident with my father's watch. It was a simple, elegant timepiece, a legacy he'd left me. After my father passed, a wave of grief had washed over me, and I'd found myself wearing the watch constantly, a tangible connection to him. My husband, noticing my attachment, had declared, with an air of magnanimity, that he would take care of it for me for safekeeping. I'd been hesitant, a prickle of unease, but he'd insisted, framing it as an act of love and protection. Weeks later, I'd seen him wearing it. Not to an event, not for a special occasion, but just around the house. And when I'd gently inquired, he'd waved it off, saying he was borrowing it to get a feel for its weight, as if it were some antique artifact he was appraising, not a cherished heirloom. The entitlement, the casual appropriation of something so deeply personal, made my stomach clench. I never saw that watch again, not really. It became just another object he possessed, another thing I'd ceded. These were the quiet battles, the silent indignities that festered. I learned to swallow my pride, to let go of the need for acknowledgement. My satisfaction became internal, a private reservoir of resilience. I focused on the tangible results of my efforts, the numbers on the balance sheet, the satisfied size of clients, the steady growth of the business. These were mine, undeniable facts that no one could take away, no matter how hard they tried to diminish my role. I was building something, and that was enough. For a while. The air in the conference room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken tension. The final quarter results were being presented, a quarterly review that usually involved a brief overview of figures and a pat on the back. But today felt different. The numbers, when they finally appeared on the screen, were staggering. Record profits. A significant leap from the previous year, driven largely by a new international expansion I'd spearheaded, a complex negotiation I'd personally overseen for months. I felt a flicker of pride, a quiet warmth spreading through me. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a shard of ice. "Remarkable quarter," he began, his tone deceptively smooth. He gestured vaguely at the figures, a dismissive sweep of his hand. And of course, we've been discussing year-end bonuses for the executive team. Given these exceptional results, we've decided to allocate a substantial portion of the profits towards those bonuses, as a reward for their hard work and dedication. My breath hitched. He hadn't included me in that group. Not once had he mentioned my role in this success, the tireless effort, the sleepless nights, the sheer grit it had taken. It was as if I were invisible, a phantom presence in the room, while he, the great architect of all things, was being lauded for achievements. The air around me felt suddenly cold, a sharp contrast to the flush of pride I'd felt moments before. He continued, oblivious, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the seismic shift that had occurred within me. Which is why, he added, a faint smile playing on his lips, a cruel, knowing curve, we're also taking this opportunity to streamline the management structure. Effective immediately. The words hung in the air, heavy and resonant. Streamline. It was corporate jargon, a euphemism for something far more brutal. I looked at him, at the self-satisfied smirk that was now fully formed, the way his eyes scanned the room as if expecting a standing ovation. He hadn't even bothered to look at me directly. He spoke as if I were not even present, a discarded tool, no longer useful. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the hum of the projector. My mind, usually a rapid-fire processing unit, went strangely still. The initial shock gave way to a profound, chilling clarity. The game had changed. And it was no longer a game of quiet endurance. The following hours were a blur of calculated action. I didn't storm out. I didn't yell. I simply stood, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were moving through deep water. I met his gaze then, for the first time since he'd uttered those damning words. There was no anger in my eyes, no pleading, only a quiet, almost serene, resolve. He flinched, a barely perceptible tremor, the smugness faltering for a fraction of a second. I walked over to my briefcase, my movements unnervingly calm. I unlatched it, and with the same deliberate precision, pulled out a thick, bound document. It was my employment contract, the one I'd signed 7 years ago, the one that included a specific clause regarding my position and compensation, a clause I'd insisted upon, a clause he'd barely skimmed, trusting in my supposed subservience. I walked back to the table, my footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. I laid the document down, directly in front of him, nudging it gently with my fingertips so it lay squarely in the center of his pristine workspace. "What is this?" he asked, his voice losing its earlier bravado, replaced by a rising unease. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the contract to a specific page, a page I knew by heart. I pointed to a paragraph, my finger tracing the words. It was the clause that stipulated my role, my equity, and a percentage of the net profits, contingent on my continued employment and my agreement to specific terms. It also contained a provision for termination, outlining the conditions and, crucially, the financial repercussions for breach of contract by the company. I had drafted it with the foresight of a seasoned strategist, anticipating scenarios like this, the inevitable moment when his entitlement would collide with the reality of our agreement. He scanned the paragraph, his brow furrowing. Then his eyes widened, a flicker of panic igniting in their depths. He looked up at me, truly looked at me, for the first time that day. The arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a raw, dawning horror. He stammered, This is preposterous. You can't possibly expect." I simply closed the contract, my fingers brushing against the embossed cover. "The clause is clear," I stated, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "It states that any termination without cause, and given the company's current financial standing and profitability, the bonuses you mentioned are clearly tied to those profits, will result in a payout equivalent to 20% of the net profits for the preceding fiscal year. A figure, I might add, that is quite substantial." His face drained of color. The smug certainty that had characterized him moments before was replaced by a ghastly pallor. He looked at the contract, then at me, then back at the contract, as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The silence in the room was now charged with a different kind of tension, a suffocating weight of his realization. He was trapped. The carefully constructed edifice of his perceived power had crumbled, revealing the hollow man beneath. The immediate aftermath was a cacophony of desperate, panicked communication. His texts flooded my phone, a torrent of disbelief, rage, and pathetic pleas. I ignored them, letting them pile up, unread, unacknowledged. Then came the calls from his flying monkeys, well-meaning relatives and business associates, roped into his crisis, their voices laced with a mixture of confusion and thinly veiled accusation. They spoke of misunderstandings, of unnecessary drama, of how I was ruining everything. I listened patiently, offering polite, non-committal responses, never betraying the cold satisfaction that simmered beneath the surface. He had underestimated me, not just as a partner, but as a person. He had seen my quiet endurance as weakness, my dedication as servitude. He had mistaken my resilience for docility, my adherence to our agreement for blind loyalty. And in his arrogance, he had signed his own downfall. The 20% was not just a financial consequence, it was a stark, irrefutable testament to my value, a value he had so consistently denied. He had built his empire on my labor, my intellect, my quiet strength, and in his final act of dismissal, he had been forced to pay the full price for its foundation. The calls eventually dwindled, replaced by an almost deafening silence from his side. His name, once a frequent fixture in business circles, began to fade, replaced by whispers of financial ruin and ill-advised decisions. The social consequences were subtle but absolute, the quiet ostracization that follows a man who is no longer deemed profitable or powerful. My life, the one I had painstakingly rebuilt, continued its steady course, free from the shadow of his entitlement. The satisfaction was not in his ruin, but in the quiet, absolute certainty of my own vindication. The contract, a simple piece of paper, had spoken louder than any shouted accusation, a chillingly precise execution of a debt long overdue.